Hi guys, here it is, the tutorial for DrawTerrain. I'm gonna show you from scratch how to use the tool, how to import it. I will show you how the preset works, how to import them, and how to create a bit more advanced setups, a bit like the canyon that I have in the presets. Let me show them. So these are all of the presets that come with the add-on, or the asset library, because it's not an add-on. And I will open some of these. I will also show you how, because each of these files, if you open them in your asset browser, you can have the files as they are, and you can analyze them, see how they are made, the lighting, the shading, how the node setup is made. Everything is as they are. So you can also do that, like them and use them in your project, but also just analyze them and study them. But for now, I will go from the beginning and just create the most basic thing, meaning a plane. The advantage of DrawTerrain, the way I like to work with it, is to work at real scale of the terrain. So shouldn't be shy of scaling up your terrain. Always apply the scale, because it will help the calculation to be consistent between the different planes, and then you will understand a bit more over time the different values and what they mean. But you can also not apply it in certain cases. We might see it in the tutorial. So there's different ways to call on DrawTerrain once you installed it in your asset library. So if you go in your file path, asset library, you can have DrawTerrain, and you can have it appearing here. So the one B4.0 is for Blender 4.0, and the other one is for 4.1 and 4.2. I am on 4.2 right now. So you can call the add-on like this, the modifier like this, or you can come drag it down from the asset browser, DrawTerrain. If you go here, you have all of them. So, and the utility mask that I will show later, it's to help you in your shading journey. So now I have DrawTerrain. The only thing else I need to start going is a curve. I will go in edit mode, delete the curve, and I'm just gonna draw one. I often draw from the cursor, so I place the cursor in the depth, so I know where the curve will be appearing from. And like this you can have a bit of sense of where you are in space. So you just need to pick the curve, and that's it. What you might notice that nothing seems to happen. The thing is that there is only one polygon here. DrawTerrain needs a minimum of polygons to start gathering the data and subdividing the mesh. So what you can do is start with a base subdivision of 3 or 4, depending on what you need, and then you can start increasing the spread, and now the curve will start following. And after that you can add some subdivision levels to start refining your terrain, and that's it. And it's very fast, it's just following as you would expect it. If you go below the ground, it will start carving. So one of the big features that I want to talk about first is the adaptive subdivision of the terrain. So the advantage, and why I worked quite a long time to try to figure this out, is to optimize Blender basically, and the calculation, because it becomes heavy very fast. So having this adaptive subdivision helps a lot to optimize your terrain, your scenes, and not have something that's too slow, because the goal is also to have fun and have something interactive. You can work with the subdivision threshold, basically to add a bit more details on the top, and then spread it a bit more towards the bottom if you need to. But the more you add, the slower it gets. So you need to be mindful of the details you're adding. I will put the chaos factor to 0 right now, just to show how it follows the curve without any particular disturbance in the modifier. So another very important setting is the spread, which means how wide your mountains or your canyons or your features will be. And it is kind of relative to the size of your curves, so it might update a bit depending on the highest point and the lowest point. And it will try also to make sure that the highest point is a bit wider than the lower one, which gives a slightly more natural feeling. But what you can do also, if I go back in edit mode and select these 2 points with Alt S, or here with the radius, you can tweak the spread. So if I remove this one, it's too close. Here you can see how the spread is affected by the value. Here, Alt S, so you can control. So that's for the spread. The top plateau will flatten the top part of your curve. It's very handy if you want to create mesa or stratification effect on your terrain, but also if you want to have a mountain that's not too steep. So for example, if it's too flat, you can smooth a bit your terrain and have something that's softer, and then it will look more like a hill or even more very soft terrain. Or if you go back to 0, be careful that if the top plateau goes beyond the spread, at some point it might break and the calculation might start to freak out a bit. Just something to be mindful about. So in general, if I have something that's very close like that and I want to switch the spread and the plateau at the same time, I click and drag and then switch the two of them. So the ratio between the two values stay the same, but you can still tweak the spread. So we just saw the peak smooth. I'm gonna reset this to 0. And now I'll show you the curvature. So the curvature is here to help you shape your terrain like this, either in one direction or the other. If you raise it too much, lower it too much, it can create these sort of things, which could be a happy accident that can be interesting sometimes. So I kind of left that behavior there. But you can have this sort of plateau effect that you can also combine with the top plateau if you want to. So you can have the plateau and then you can have a very steep slope after that, for example, or it's more rounded. So we saw already the subdivision threshold. Whenever I want to work on the subdivision threshold, I always put my viewport into the wireframe mode just to see what I'm doing and then figuring out what I actually need. Because in general, you don't need that much detail straight into the geometry, because you will have a pass of shading that will add those details. What you do need though is the silhouette to be broken down a bit to give a more natural feeling. And that's why I have the chaos and the peak noise setting. First I will show you the chaos. The chaos will bring chaos, as it says, to the curves, so it will disturb them and then it will give a more broken down feeling to your mountain. So you can either change the scale size, noise size from here, increase the factor, so the overall scale, and then you have control over the 3 different axes. So you can have a lot of displacement on the z-axis or 0, which will follow and only displace on x and y, or you can have it only in one or the other direction depending on what you need. And if you put something that's very low, you can control a bit more. You have control over the look of it. And see how when I control the subdivision threshold, you can push the details to the bottom or have them stick to the top of it, the top of your mountain. So this is just something you can play around with and find what works best for you. So if I make the noise very small, you can see how everything is affected. And one advantage of the chaos feature is that if you don't go that crazy, I put it to length 20, then with one curve you can start having the feeling of a mountain range. So if I go and paint this curve on the plane, raise it, and now I need a larger spread, for example. So you start having this broken down effect, and as if there were rocks that were broken by the elevation of the mountain. And then afterwards you can always shape it the way you like. So that's the first setting, to give a bit of a life and a natural aspect to your terrain, because if you remove it, it's kind of very linear, which is good, for example, for sand dunes and these types of terrains that are very smooth. You can very easily have this like that. And if you want to change the curvature like this, you can really have the feeling of dunes, see, with all of these effects. And if you want to break the silhouette a bit more, you can activate the noise strength. It is based on height, so by default there is a noise that is applied, and on the height that is masking the noise. If you put it to 0, it will go down to the ground, But if you raise it, it will be isolated on the peaks. So it's up to you to decide what effect you want, but it helps breaking down the silhouette. I am just going to raise a bit the clipping, a bit more, if we create a larger terrain. And I suggest also, if you work with large scenes, to increase the clip start just 1 or 2, because Blender has artifacts sometimes when it's too small like that. You can see here the tiny black parts. It can be worse sometimes, so just by raising it a bit, it will make them disappear. And it doesn't mean that you can see anything, you can still be quite close to your objects. So the peak noise is really the goal, to break the silhouette, give a bit of chaos and a more natural aspect to your terrain, as if there was rocks a bit broken on the top, or you can even simulate having a forest with trees breaking down the silhouette. You can of course work with the seed. And something particular about this noise is that it's mapped on the curve UVs, because all of the curves affecting DrawTerrain are creating UVs that follow them. Why is this? Is because you can then map noise and textures following your terrain. So let me show you. If I draw another one, you can see here the noise following the curve. If I go even lower here, you can see how it's following. And if I invert, put 0, 1 here and point 0, 0, 1 here, it will go across. So that's how I did for the dunes, to create a bit this feeling of sand falling down the dune. And managing your level of subdivision, you can give the right effect. So sometimes going higher in subdivision is not necessarily what will give you the effect that you would intend or would expect. And like this, you can control also the subdivision to only have this effect being here, and then it moves down. So you have some control over the noise that is being applied, the detail, the roughness, the lacunarity, and the distortion of that noise. So that's for the basic settings of DrawTerrain. There is one that I left out, and I'm gonna talk right now. Oh, there's two actually with the curve index, but I'll talk about it just in a bit. Delete unused geo is very useful when you want to create an asset that you want to scatter in your scene, but you don't want to have to deal with the whole terrain. So this is creating a mask and deleting whatever is not inside. You can reduce the expand, which will be just the influence of the curve, or if you need to, in certain cases, you need to expand it a bit, so you have that ability. This was a recommendation from my friend Nicolas Piaca, and I'm very grateful for this recommendation. But be careful, if you delete your curve, the terrain will disappear because it has nothing affecting it. So you can see how now I can have that mountain that I can integrate, for example, on another terrain. If I duplicate that plane, duplicate the curve and apply the second curve, I will just do this, duplicate the curve around, and now you can see how you have this asset that can be integrated into your terrain if you want to. There's one feature in the way the curve works that I do like, when it's important to be aware that it exists, is the fact that if you intersect two curves, one will cut the other one, the lower one will cut the upper one, which I like because you can just cut out your terrains like this and create openings. It can be very interesting the way terrain can be affected. And if the curve intersect at the same point, or roughly, they will merge very nicely like that. And then you can always blend them even more with peak smooth. So the last thing, the curve index, I will show later, it's for the shading. When you add a path, like a second time the modifier on the same mesh, to add a path or anything like that. But let's see about it in a minute. For now, let's continue playing a bit with this. I will delete these curves and I will just draw, let's say, a shape. It's like this. Put my cursor around here, draw another terrain. And why I really like working on the real scale value is that when you press, oh, I forgot to turn on screencast, sorry. If you press Shift tilde, you can move around and walk around like in Unreal Engine with the WASD. And if you press Tab, you can activate gravity and now you start walking on the ground. And it's really nice to have a feeling of your space and of your terrain in that case. because you can have the sense of the scale, because it takes you a certain amount of time to walk from a place to another, to look around, you have the sense of the parallax, etc. Something I want to show you is that, as you can see, there is nothing to set up the material in there. It's because you can set up the materials just like you would do normally. So if I set up one like that and I go in preview mode, and if you do its thing, it's just applied like this. You don't need to set up anything. And if for some reason you want to add a different one, a second material, you can assign it. For now, this is just one polygon. So we need to lower the base subdivision to 0. We don't need to put to 0, but it's just to avoid over calculation and then computer crying. Polygons don't need to be perfectly square, it's just a bit better if they are square-ish. And now I have some subdivision to work with. So if I had a second material that I make in blue and I select these vertices and assign this material, you can see that it's applied. So you cannot blend between these two because this is applied on the polygons, right? If you want to add blending between different materials, either in height, either by vertex painting or by textures or anything, you need to use, or you can use, the vertex painting. I will show you, and that's where the utility node comes in. So if I go in the shader editor and I bring it the utility mask, so it's basically this. So you can see that we find the curve index here. So it needs to match the one that is on your modifier for these first 4 nodes. This one, the vertex paint layers, shared with all of them. It doesn't matter which curve. So it's basically the same as doing a color attribute node. You don't need to use this necessarily. You can use a color attribute node and use any of those. They appear here because they are created in the DrawTerrain modifier, but they don't exist yet on your object. You need to create them. So here I will remove this one and create one that is called layer DR1 to match that layer. So now if I pre-visualize it, it's all black and I can start painting. So now I can start painting my mask the way I want to. It's dependent on the vertices, so you need more. If you need more precise selection, you might need to subdivide more your mesh. So be mindful of this and always keep in mind the amount of topology. In general, when you put the base subdivision to 3 or 4, it's roughly this size of a polygon, which is quite large already when you see compared to our tiny character. So I could go here, reduce one subdivision, and then add one here. So it's roughly the same density, and now you have more to paint with. So you can be a bit more precise. What you see is not really what exists. All of the volumes generated by DrawTerrain are kind of virtual, they don't really exist as polygons. So you cannot be like this and paint the top of the mountain. You need to see top down and paint the polygons that are lying under the mountain. But that would be a pain to just paint every time following your mountains. So that's why I give you some of these masks. So the height is your height map. For some reason, for now, if there is nothing going below the ground plane, it doesn't show exactly perfectly. So I might fix this, but it's still very useful to isolate the height, because then you can come with a color ramp and you can start masking by height, which is very useful if you want to have a snow line, for example, above a certain height. You have then the slope. So actually, if I plug the slope here and reuse that, so you can isolate the parts that are angled and the parts that are more flat. If you want to map, for example, rocks on the steep surfaces, and if you want to have something more like grass, for example, on the flat surfaces. Here I can increase a bit more to have more detail. But overall, that's what this node gives you, which is very useful. And here you have the curve influence. So really just the influence of the curve. It can be useful to create a mask for texturing, especially when you map something from the UVs. If I take a noise texture, for example, that I use the UVs of the curve, you can see that it's following the curves. but outside of the curve influence, it's kind of creating these artifacts. So to avoid this for now, until I find a better solution, you can mix the color like this in with multiply, for example, and then like that you can isolate your noise where you want it to, or you can put it in the factor and then you can mask it or invert it. Now it's not mix, it's not multiply anymore. So, and like this here you can plug anything else. You can plug, let's say, another noise texture that is not mapped on the UVs, and like this it will just should look normal. You need to plug things in the UVs because the generated doesn't really work. It can't really compute. But any UVs that you put on your terrain, and usually a plane has UVs, they will be carried over to the final result. So you can use this. And then you can work on the ratio between the two, which one is affected and which one is... And so if I show quickly here, if I go back to solid view, I will duplicate this curve and just keep one of them. Let's say I have this one. If I bring a DrawTerrain, another one, and put the base subdivision to 0, because we already have a base subdivision, and select the new curve, it's going to have a second level of DrawTerrain on top of the other one. Just be careful with your subdivisions, because now you can start having something that's becoming heavy. But if now I set the spread, for example, let's say we want something that is way more soft as a base, so no chaos and none of this so kills. And for this I don't need that much subdivision actually. I can have this one integrates into the first mountains but have a different type of features. It could have a plateau and it could have a larger disturbance like chaos, and it will continue to integrate. And now if I preview, for example, the curve influence here and go back in preview mode, I need to put this one on curve index 1 because this is the second modifier. And you can see here you have curve index 0 and now curve index 1. So that's how you can isolate and then map on the same shader depending on the different curves or modifier that you have. And same for the UVs, for example. Here I'm curve index 1, so it's mapping on that one. But if I put it back to 0, it's mapping on the previous ones now. Before carrying on and showing you the presets and how to use them, I wanted to touch on another aspect of performance. So let's say we have a camera angle that's like this, for example. And we have our mountains, we have everything around, but we want some background mountains, of course. And we would probably want, if we can even have also, actually, if I add another terrain and duplicate this one and make it smaller, we could have a plane that is our very foreground that we can sculpt with some curve. Let's say I have a curve here. I'm gonna draw something on it. Let's see the shapes we would like. That S shape that every artist like to use in the composition. Then we can just draw it in directly in there. So we can have a foreground that is nicely designed like this and can be, let's say, more detailed. And we could have something like that. So we have the foreground that's quite detailed. And then we can have also the background that's a bit less detailed. And we can continue on having receding details like this in the distance. How do you do that? You can see that I draw my curve to go beyond my plane. So instead of trying to match everything and have one plane that does all of the work, you can duplicate your plane, and then if they are affected by the same DrawTerrain curve, they will just continue the work. Often it's better to have a certain level of overlap between the two to help the calculation, because it's not always easy for DrawTerrain to handle this, and it's not sometimes precise enough to be able to do this. So you probably need to be a bit playing around with it, but in most cases, because you will be able to have a nice result. And you can lower the level of details in the background. I can increase it here because I want more details. Here I can even have less subdivision threshold and keep a level of detail a bit higher, but then I save on memory and just manage the silhouette work to be interesting. And you can keep on doing this. I can just duplicate it like that. Duplicate once again here, maybe make them overlap a bit more. Let's make my plane big again, like we were doing earlier. And like this you have a very performant terrain that can be very large. If it's for the background, you can also just skew this one on the side and apply the transformation to keep the same ratio of spread and the way noises are applied and everything. So like this, everything is consistent. So that's a very good way to have extremely large scale terrains, because I can add another one and here either draw on the same curve or duplicate my curve and just point these to the new one. And like this I'm just creating some new mountains in the background. And this can be very, very wide because it doesn't really matter. As you can see, the subdivision only applies where there is these polygons, and this is just one polygon. It's extremely large polygon, but doesn't really matter in terms of performance. And you can see also, just checking the size, this is 2 km wide and almost 1 km in depth. So if you would use atmospheric perspective, you would have a very cohesive result and interesting to look at. So that's how you can optimize your scene, and then how you can have the feeling of vast space while retaining maximum playability with your terrain. So see, it starts to be slightly slower when you walk on 3 planes at the same time, plus one that's a bit more subdivided, but it's still not too bad. And you can walk on your foreground, like really have it separated from the rest, which will allow you to have more control over it and over your details. You can go even higher, why not? Now let's talk about the presets that come with DrawTerrain. There's a couple of things I realized that probably are not as obvious. And there's a way, the way it's now is also not the most straightforward because of the way Blender handles. As you can see, a tiny box, it means that it's a collection. It was the best way I found so far to bring every asset necessary, but it comes with something that's a bit unpractical. I will show you. So the way to use the assets, the presets, you can go in your DrawTerrain asset library in presets, drag and drop it into your scene, and that's it, you have the preset. The only thing is that you can see here, it's only a collection, so the objects are not physically there really. You could use it and render it as it is, but if you want to edit it, there's 2 methods. Either here in the add collection you click on instance, and now you can see that the collection is open and all of the objects are accessible. That's kind of the best option because it keeps the organization. Otherwise, if I Ctrl Z and re-import it, if I forget to untick this button and I do anything, like just even a click, this is stuck there. There is one way to import it and be able to access the curve is to press Ctrl A and make instance real. Or you can do it here, apply, object, apply, make instance real. And then it will bring everything in. It will just not keep any organization, which you can still put back in a collection because everything is selected. And there's this empty that just remains. If you use machine tool, you can also do it with their tool, and they have a button to do the same. So here you have your mountain in there, and let's break down a bit what it is and how it's made. First I will just import an HDRI. I'm always using Photographer where whatever I do. So here it is, that's the way it imports. Because I opened a new file, I will need to do this again. And you can change the curve, you can move it around, like anything will update as you would expect with a DrawTerrain file. There's 2 planes here. One is the actual rocks with the small like shader with a sort of snow deposit, and there is the snow. The snow, the way it's made, it's the same as the rocks with a different shader, but with a lot of smoothing. And the more smoothing you add, the more melted snow you add. It's like mimicking that type of behavior. If you reduce the adaptive subdivision, you can also have a different feeling or behavior, and you can also have it more optimal. Here it's already at quite a high subdivision level, but you can still raise it more if you feel like it. You can check the vision threshold. So that's how you import a preset and how you can make it editable. let's delete everything, this, delete hierarchy, and I will import another one. Which one can I import? Maybe the hills, and then I will open the files themselves to show you. The hills is the only one that imports the whole scene because I forgot to apply it. Because I thought it was a good example. The first plane has a more complex shader with a road and a path, and the background is more like soft mountain with different levels of subdivisions to it and smoothing. So the way the path is done, I can show you and use this example here since it's there. So the path is just a second modifier here. I put the curve index to 1, which is what allows me to have the shading on the path here. And then I'm using the UVs of the curve. You can see that there are some artifacts of mapping. It's not always perfect. You can decide not to use the mapping of the curve, or you can also decide to mask thanks to the curve influence. I'll show you quickly. So the curve influence here is driving the transition here. Let's see if I remove these ones for now. This one needs to be here. See how with the curve influence of the index 1, so the second curve, I can drive the way the road looks. And let's say I tweak it like this. And if I want to, for example, you want to have this type of path where there is 2 paths on the side and a bit of grass and more amount of soil and in the middle. You can very easily do this. For example, I could remove or reduce the top plateau to, say, 0.1, have the spread to 1, maybe I need to make this a bit wider, still a bit wide, 0.5, and then reduce or remove the chaos something. So if I put the spread to 1, reduce a bit the curvature and all of this, I can then go in my curve, duplicate it and offset it on the right a bit. And if I continue tweaking the settings, I could narrow down even more the path until you start having that separation of the two roads, for example. So here I didn't have enough subdivision, so if I add a bit more and increase a bit the subdivision threshold, you can have very straight lines. But if I add more chaos to it, you can start having something a bit more natural. So that's one way to do it, and you can change the curvature, you can change the subdivision threshold, you can have them slightly wider so they merge a bit better at the middle, and then you can tweak the proportions of your curve the way you want. So that's how you would handle it, and then you can move your curve around, of course, and it will adapt. And all of this happens on top of the already deformed terrain. So that's what I wanted to show you with this setting. What I will do now is that I will bring in some of the presets scenes themselves and show you what you can get from them. So this is the dune scene. So this one, which this asset comes from. And if I collapse this and start the render, and if I go in the camera, you can see that's exactly what you get from the preset and the preview that I put in the trailer. And the cool thing is that you can see some of the tricks I used, the way I mapped the texture. You can play around with the curves themselves and transform the terrain. You can see how it's handled with the space and in the depth to save memory. And even tiny cheats I made here to give the feeling of floating sand, or like a sand being blown away in the wind. If some things are not selectable, I think they are. Just need to click on them here. You can see here it's just a mixed box, and you can see how it's made. It's very simple. Noise gradient and gradient texture and noise texture blended in the volume. Fairly simple. But it gives the effect intent, so that's the goal. Another one is the canyon one, and I will show you how to make this from scratch to explain a bit some of the concepts behind it. So this one is quite a complex scene. So this one has a lot, and if I render it, it's quite a heavy scene, but it's very good one to analyze, I think, because you can see how some mapping is done, separation of the top and side faces for the water and all of it, like the way I handle the depths and everything. And you can go in the camera view, and that's exactly what I get from the trailer. and you have the second angle. So I will start from scratch and doing some terrain that looks like a canyon like this and explain the thought process behind how this works. So let's create a new file, create a mesh, a plane. Let's make it quite big and maybe more elongated like that. Apply the scale, I will pre-subdivide it. Add DrawTerrain, so with the same simple steps. Create a Bezier curve, I will draw it on my plane like that. And let's select it. So for now nothing too much happens. But the way I handle canyon in this case is that I lower the curve. Because like this you can have that plateau, especially if your point of view will be at the bottom. You can have that plateau and increase the top plateau actually. Let's widen it a bit more. So you can see why I handle it like that. And one setting I didn't talk about is the auto smooth angle. This can help if you want to have a bit more stylized or sharp edges in your landscape. So you can deal with this and see what works best. The default is at 80, a bit arbitrary, but works best in most cases, so that's why I left it like that. So this, for example, could be your base, like the tallest area of your canyon. You can also have the plateau a bit less sharp and have the curvature dealing with this instead. So for example, you could have something like this. In this case, I will keep the plateau like that. So the idea here is to duplicate your plane and then you can lower it down. And what you can do then is lower the spread and the top plateau at the same time. And you can create those sort of stratification that you were seeing in the other file. And you can add a bit more subdivision. So this one is a bit more tricky because you need to push the subdivision a bit further to have a good result. But you could optimize it like this. And here, add one more. And what you can do if you want to add that sort of sedimentation going down is duplicate it again. You don't need that much subdivision in this case. And you can increase the peak smoothing and reduce the plateau, for example. And like this you have that sort of sediment going down. You can change the curvature if you want to change the way it looks. And just basically tweak it until you find the result that you like. Sometimes adding one more subdivision level will make it follow more closely, but you can tweak the subdivision threshold and refine your results. So that's basically what I did, and you can continue the process over and over as many times as you want to. You can add another one and lower it and then reduce the spread way more until it starts showing up here. In this case, the top plateau, that's too strong actually. But then we could add more chaos to give it some randomness. And you can change the seed of the chaos, so the noise that's affecting these planes is not the same. So that's basically how I did it for the canyon. So you can see that now the setup is way more heavy than all of the ones before because I pushed a bit the settings and the subdivisions. I want to show you also that the bottom of your terrain doesn't have to be flat, but now the top plateau is kind of messing around with the calculation. So that's cases where when it's higher than the spread, it's no goodie. Bit the spread on all of them because I did the same mistake for all of them. And here you go, and now you have a nice descent into your canyon, and you can do in playable mode, and then you can walk down there. And then I will show you how you can take advantage of the delete unused geo. For example, creating a plane here to create some sort of like spikes. I can create a Bezier curve. I will scale it. Be careful when you scale Bezier curve in object mode, because for example here I am on 1 in scale and 1 in radius. If I scale up my curve and see here I'm 5.9, I apply the scale. So the scale of the object is at 1, but the mean radius of the curve is at 5.9. So then you need to put it back to 1, otherwise it will affect the way the radius is affecting the curve. If you don't apply the scale, it's fine, but if you do, be mindful. So let's apply this. I forgot to apply the scale on this one. See, if I scale the object without applying the scale, it's fine. But if I apply the scale, it's gonna change the calculation. So we can have that terrain, add a bit of plateau, curvature if you want to. I could duplicate this one, add a peak smooth, reduce a bit the plateau, reduce the subdivision level. And now if I select delete unused, you can start creating an asset that could be placed anywhere in your scene. So if I select the 3 of them and then I parent them to the main one, I can move it around, I can scale it, I can place the way I want to, and I can always change my curve to find the effect that I want. If I select the 3 of them, I can add another one here, and I can scale my curve to make it look different, or even duplicate it to have another one and have different level or anything you like. So that's a good way to create assets and place them around and customize your scene like this as you go along. You could add way more factor of the chaos, for example, on the vertical, change the noise size if you want. So that's how I approached this. And then you can tweak the settings here. If it's way too tight, you can have a more slanted terrain. You can reduce a bit the subdivision. And then if we just pre-visualize it, it looks like in render view. Then you have something like this. Cast shadows that has artifacts that can help your shading, or probably you would need to push a bit further the geometry to solve those problems. It's a matter of experimenting and then finding what works for the need of your scene. Now I wanted to show you the moon crater preset because it has a particular way of handling deformation, and also it's a different way than using path of using the second modifier to add some small craters. It's basically these tiny curves that I drew around and then I just inset slightly and it creates these craters. And why do I have those concentric circles to make the craters? Is because, for example, if I lower them down the way the tool works, for example here between them it will create this sort of gradient, like going up and down, and then the middle part stays like this. And if I want to have the same level of depth in that crater, but I don't want this protruding up, you just come and take one of these circles, you can duplicate it and scale it down. And then like this you can smooth the transition and have the effect of the curve effect to a lower point. And each of them can be each of these curves. You can take them and lower them to change the depth of your crater. So that's very simple. And if you need more geometry, I try to make it as light as possible as a preset, but then you can, here, be careful to be on the first one. You can add more subdivision to have more details. When you're closer to your render, you're happy with your shapes and the way the terrain behaves, you can just push the details, because once it's done, it won't have to recalculate as long as you don't move it again. So it can be heavy, like now it's still calculating. So it can be very heavy, so be careful, but once the calculation is done, you don't need to touch it again. But sometimes more resolution doesn't mean a better terrain. Like here, for example, it looks a bit unnatural. And I think when it was at 3, it was looking better, because on top of that you have the shading that will also carry a lot of the weight for the final look. But here it's a bit soft on the side, and with 4 slightly more sharp, so just depends on what you're looking for. And in the back, so I separated the different curves object, so they don't have to recalculate every time I move one. For example, the back here, I didn't even add the tiny craters. I just found with a happy accident some of these happening, and because my shot was from this angle, I don't really need to have the background being that detailed. So here, these two, for example, are still linked together, but because they were far, and I was just duplicating these craters around. I will show you one last preset, because this one has a very particular way and very underestimated way of using the tool. So I just need to explain a bit the concept. So let me create a new plane. You can see these terrains, they have that slant here, and then it's going straight, and sometimes it's even slanted back like that. You cannot have that behavior by default because the way things are calculated, if I take a new curve and I make a new DrawTerrain out of this one, select that small curve. So it goes from top to down and then it will spread by the spread, right? It's using the normal, so perpendicular to the plane. But using this knowledge, you can go, what I did to do this, you go on edit mode and you can rotate your plane in one axis and then it will skew the way the normals are perceived by Blender. And then if I rotate it back horizontally, now I start having something that's skewed like that. And you control a bit less, like it's less predictable, but you can have very cool results doing this. And you can always mess with the look of it. You can extrude it, you can do what you would do normally, or even have a second one. But then it will use that distorted space. So basically we are messing up with the way Blender understands the space and the normals of these curves. And you can combine these effects. So then you just need to be able to know where it's going. This is a bit extreme. Let's stay with this for now. So you can create these really cool spikes doing this. You can add a bit of noise, maybe a bit more resolution. So now you see a bit how far you can push the tool if you get a bit creative with the way you use it. And nothing stops you also to use modifiers on top of that. So if I create an empty here, scale it. I have an empty here and I will just create a mirror from there. Now you can have a mirrored version of your mesh. You can either bisect it or not, depending on what looks nice. You can rotate this. So you can really just have fun and create very crazy designs by playing with some generative modifiers like this. You could create an array. You can have screw modifier, which is quite crazy, or a simple deform that you can twist or bend your terrain in different directions. And then if you want to make it an asset reusable, you can just do this, use the delete geo and then continue playing around. So yeah, this is really open to have fun. You can also use a lattice. If I use hard dots, just so it creates it on the right scale roughly. And you can push your shape even further, and like that you have a crazy shapes like this that you can, and then you can always apply DrawTerrain and anything else and continue sculpting it. So then you can continue sculpting it if you want to. You can grab it, you can do whatever. So that's how I did this terrain and how I handled the slanted part of these mountains. So I really suggest to open the files and see a bit how I did the shading, how I did even the rendering, the lighting, if you're interested in seeing this. This is a cloud card, mountain. So this is there's basic things using the tools provided and using a bit of texture blender also, because I just find it so useful and so fast. So yeah, I think that's it for now. Next I will make a demo and show you how to create a terrain in illustration from scratch until the end. So handling creation of the terrain, the shading, the lighting and rendering, a bit of Blender post-process thanks to the add-on photographer, and that will be it. So there's one more thing I want to talk about, is the documentation for all of my tools. I try to make it as interesting to look at as possible. So there's a bit of text and always a video to explain what I'm talking about. So you can take a look at it, play the videos. And at the end, I'm talking about a feature I'm very happy with and I'm very excited for, is the fact that you can export your height map into Gaia or Unreal Engine or any other tool to create high definition terrains. So it doesn't have to be only for concept artists. Even matte painter can work on their composition, have the shapes of your terrain the way you need them to for your shot. And you can then export this to Gaia, have a very high res erosion with realistic details, and then you can re-import it into Blender and you know that your composition will be saved. And even after, if you make an update to your curve, you can re-export your height map, update it into Gaia or World Creator or woodeny, and your terrain will update instantly, and you will have your highly detailed and eroded terrain. So this is a really cool feature that I really wanted there. So here's the demo part of the tutorial. I'm presenting here some of the references I used to make the final environment. I was inspired by Icelandic environment, and I wanted to have something with a bit of different landscape features, like the ground with the sort of black sand, the river, and see how we could make it happen like this with DrawTerrain. Have the slopes with the grass, and then more steep areas with the rocks, and show you the different techniques we could use to do this in terms of shading, and in terms also of using DrawTerrain to achieve this with different planes like I've been showing in the tutorial. And as good concept artists, you also always need references, so always start by looking for them before starting. So like we've been doing a couple of times, always create a plane, scale it to roughly what you think your terrain should be at first, and you can always change it, update it. So scale it up, and always remember to apply your scale after. When you want to do an illustration, it's good to have a camera set up pretty early on, just to know what you need to work on and what the shapes of your terrain will look like, and your composition, of course. Setting up and then start clip for the viewport, just to prepare and not have artifacts, and make sure I don't have the terrain disappearing in the distance after. You can make it bigger than 5,000. I don't know why I'm sticking to 5,000. But it's already quite a big terrain if you have a 5 kilometer terrain. So I'm not gonna comment on all of the parts of what I'm doing. I will probably create a time lapse of some parts, and just comment on when I think it could be useful to add some information. So remember, when you create a terrain that is not pre-subdivided, always add a base subdivision to 3 or 4. In general, 3 is enough to pick up the curve, and then with the spread you can start having your terrain appearing and adding adaptive subdivision levels to refine it a bit more. So for the first mountain, I wanted to have just a blocking of the general shapes of my landscape. So here I'm setting up my camera on the side just to be able to check the composition. And while doing this, I was regularly checking on my references on my other screen to make sure I get inspired and know a bit what I'm doing. So here, moving on to the mountains a bit on the middle ground, trying to start creating a sense of depth and space while still keeping it very rough, because it's very easy afterwards to just change the curve roughly and change the settings in DrawTerrain to give it a particular look. But at the beginning you can work with extremely low poly terrain just to have your masses coming through. The curvature is really good to give a sense of erosion a bit, that angle that will come over time with all of the rocks being eroded and all of the sand and sediments. Okay, moving on to more background. I often just duplicate the curves I have, so I don't need to recreate one. And sometimes just moving them around is enough to have a new set of mountains or hills or whatever you're creating. Something that's really good, you can set your cursor in the correct depth, and then you go in your camera and you can draw the shape of your mountain from the camera point of view. Like this, you have control on the composition that it creates. It will create it parallel to your camera, So to add feeling of mountain that goes into the depth is not really, you cannot do it like this, but like I was doing, you can always rotate it afterwards and play with the composition. My goal here was to start creating a bit of overlap between the different planes, like midground, foreground and background, because that's how you suggest depth and distance. And now I realized that I could change the point of view of the camera to have a better angle. And starting to create a sort of S shape on the ground, you can see a bit. That works really well to invite the eye into the composition. So I was trying to refine that mountain on the left a bit to suggest these shapes even more. So now I'm just separating the curve to add it only on the new plane in the foreground, just so it's easier to control, and then you can isolate your details a bit more and have the one in the foreground being more detailed, and also not have to deal with intersection of different planes, for example. Or you can actually take advantage of the intersections of the different planes like this. And trying to place it so I create that sort of S shape inviting you into the composition. And to increase that feeling, I'm adding another one on the other side. Just playing around with the composition until I find something that I like. It's the advantage of having tools that are so easy to use, because you can iterate way more before you stick to a final decision. And usually it's that phase where you can iterate more that leads to a better design. Because if you're stuck with complex tools and processes or workflow, it's harder to iterate, and you need to commit to a final decision early on in your process, which prevents you from experimenting more, which if you're doing illustration or concept art, that's also the most fun part and what leads to the better results. I'm also taking advantage of the happy accident from the chaos, noise and all of this to try to see what can come from the chaos, basically. That's really why I named it like that. That's really the best part of why I like this tool. You can go in your camera, take the shapes that you like, change them, keep the ones that you like, change the ones that you don't, and work your composition with a very high degree of control. I was a bit indecisive on how to deal with the look of this mountain, so I'm playing around. I wanted to have that gentle slope like we saw in the references, like sand. So now that's what I'm doing, duplicating the plane, and I will give one of the plane a more rock look and the other one that will look more like the sediments that fell off that mountain. And trying to add also to the feeling of going into the depth. So that's why instead of having just a cone, I'm giving it more like a perspective direction. To find the look of this second plane, something you really need to play around with the spread, the curvature and the adaptive subdivision level. Often reducing the subdivision helps soften the algorithm, and then this type of soft transition, and lowering the plane helps also to control over how it's blending on the ground and how high it reaches. See how by changing the spread now I have something that's way better. So what I wanted to check now is a bit of shapes and shadows that my terrain is casting for now, to see how the depth is perceived, if there is interesting things that comes into the composition with a certain camera angle. So I'm just putting a sun, rotating it around, playing a bit, trying to get inspired. It helps refreshing your eye a bit, because the composition is changing so much just because of the shadow shapes and light parts. And then keep notes in your mind that what you like at a certain point and what you don't can inspire you to refine further what you're doing. Now we'll use Photographer to add an HDRI just to try a different way of looking at the terrain. It's easy to get lost into playing with the lighting like this, so you need to set yourself a timer to stop at some point, otherwise you can just play indefinitely. All of these HDRI, by the way, come from Polyhaven. Sometimes just take your time to think about what you want and you're trying to achieve with your environment, and the mood you want to convey also. For example, me, I knew that I wanted something with a softer lighting, a bit moody and cloudy, like a stormy environment. So I needed a more soft sun and soft lighting. So that's why I went with this for now. And then what you can do is just fake your lighting. Of course, that's what you should do most of the time actually. So you can use the area light as a spotlight if you reduce the spread, and fake sunlight coming through the clouds, acting like a spotlight. Generally, you should fake your lighting, even stage it almost as a theater. Trying to create overlap of shapes, having dark lights will help give the sense of depth and interesting points over the composition. So now we're gonna start working a bit more on the ground itself, because I wanted a river. So the advantage with working with DrawTerrain or being able to just draw the shapes is that you can create the S-curve that you like in your ground exactly the way you want it, and you know that your features will follow it. So you can think of shapes first and then you see what comes from the tool itself. What I was testing out here was to have some features on the side of my plane to create a transition between the mountains and the ground. See what it does to my composition, and if I like it, reducing or increasing the scale of the noise to have smaller bumps. Just experimenting with these takes just a minute or two, so just feel free to try things out and see if they work or not. And now I wanted to add another curve to create my river. So adding another DrawTerrain on top of the other one before, reducing the base subdivision to 0, otherwise you will pre-subdivide and it will be just too heavy. And because it's already a subdivided area, I reduce the adaptive subdivision, reducing the spread to something that could look like the width of a river. And just like that, you can add a feature to terrain that is already sculpted. In the end, I decided not to use the features on the side because they were adding a bit too much noise, and I preferred the way it looked. It was just simpler and the effect was as effective without it. And towards the end of the demo, I ended up adding more tiny terrain to add sort of rocks on the sides. Reducing the chaos and putting the Z to 0 helped to have not a broken river like I had, and here more of a regular shape. And keeping it on the X and Y, you have a bit of more randomness into your river. Increasing the top plateau to flatten the bottom of the river. So here I was trying something I haven't tried before. And just to say that you can experiment with ideas that you have. All of these ramifications in the river, I wanted to have them inside DrawTerrain. So I started drawing more rivers that would merge into each other. And it worked pretty well. was pretty happy with this. And after, I was taking advantage of the feature of having the ability to control the size of the river by controlling the size of the curve. So here you can see how it can start having this effect. So adding more subdivision, but it was getting a bit heavy. So that's when you should always check your adaptive subdivision threshold in wireframe mode, because now I was able to optimize it way more, because there's already a level of subdivision made by the first modifier itself. Now I wanted to deal a bit more with the width of the river itself to give a bit of variation. Think of what could be the main stream and what would be the side streams, and see how I could give a big, medium and small variation to it. While reducing the radius, sometimes there was a bug and didn't really like it. So what I ended up doing, instead of reducing the size of I increased the size of the element. Here I put a plane to make the water, and just making a metallic shader with a very low roughness, and like this I will have a perfectly reflective surface. I didn't necessarily need, because of the distance, to see what was below the surface of the water, so I just ended up doing it like that. Now, to have a better preview of the values of my terrain and my composition, I added one material to all of my terrains, and it gives you a way better sense of the values, because if you have it all white, it's really not representative of what you're gonna have. You can add one material for all of the terrain, at least at first, and if you need to have a particular variation of your material, you can easily just create another one after. But because of the features of the height, the slope, and all of these masks you can create, it's very easy to just blend the different materials and features together, instead of having a harsh distinction between them when the plane intersects. But we will see more about this when I start the shading. Don't forget to play with your focal length, because it gives such a different effect when you have a different focal length. Here I'm seeing a tangent between the foreground mountain and the background, so I'm just moving things around and then refining, changing the shapes, the curves. Just checking the composition, some of the leading lines, if I think anything could be changed or improved. There's a feature in Photographer, I know I'm always talking about it because I use it so much, but you can mirror your camera like you would mirror your canvas in Photoshop. It's very useful to refresh your eye. I don't use it often, but actually I should. I'm gonna create the environment, the atmospheric cubes for the volumetrics, and the way I like to do it is to separate it into like the front and the background. I got this from Piotr Kliński, I hope I'm not butchering his name, in his efficient concept art tutorial for Blender. It's a very nice way to handle atmospheric, because you have more control instead of trying to have one cube that does everything and find the perfect setting. Like this, you have more control about the far distance and the closer distance, and I find that it just looks better. Cleaning up my outliner, it's always better, and you end up saving time because you know where things are and you don't have to look for it afterwards. And separating the two materials, the one for the background, and what is nice to use is a very small amount of emission strength that will brighten a bit your background depending on what you need, but go very, very gentle to it. And then coloring it to give a bit of a art direction into your atmosphere. The advantage of controlling your cube is that you don't need to have them being too close to the camera, because when they are too close, sometimes you can wash out everything. So give it a bit of distance from the camera often helps. Here I was trying to add another one to have more of a ground volumetrics, to give a bit of a high fog, what you would find you have in Unreal Engine, for example. And to help the blending, I was trying to give it a gradient. I put in the density, not in the color, because it helps keep you the control over the color, and then you just add the multiply to control the strength. It's still very tricky. I didn't really like the separation it was giving at a certain height, but this also felt a bit too high. So just playing around a bit more to see if I can find a solution. I realized it wasn't going nowhere, and I usually use another technique, which is either using what I call mist box. It's an emissive shader in the volume. The advantage is that it's very light in terms of computation because there's no volumetric. It gives the same effect roughly. And like this I can have a couple of them around my scene to separate the different planes. Another technique that I like to use is have fog or smoke cards, which are just a plane with an alpha of a cloud or smoke, and I'm gonna use both of them. So here just trying to place at the strategic point in my scene to have the nice separation. Just brighten tiny bit the shapes behind different planes to separate a bit. It's like doing a lighten layer in Photoshop. Just taking my time thinking of what I want, the effect it gives. Because once the lighting is set up, you can go into texturing and detailing without worrying that your composition already works. I like to work in high contrasts for AGX, just to give a bit more of a punch to the image, to the lighting. You could easily do it in Photoshop or Krita afterwards. So now I'm gonna start the texturing process. So bringing it Quixel Bridge in this case, because I know they have a very good Icelandic library, and I already have most of the assets. So here I'm thinking what type of surfaces I need. I will need the black ground, the grass, and the rocks mostly, trying not to overcomplicate it. I liked the stratification in this one, but I ended up not doing it. So when I have my material, what I like to do is to create a cube or a sphere in one side outside on my camera and add the materials to them, just to have a sort of my library on the side, and I can look at them. It also helps because if they are not assigned to anything and you close and open Blender, they are gonna be cleaned up from the Blender file. So having them assigned to a cube, they are saved. So now what I'm looking at is the different values that I have in my materials, and thinking of the separation of the different objects and different value groups. So those are my potential ground, this is my grass. Could have chosen another grass maybe, but made it work with this one. And then here I was thinking maybe I could have desert cliff material like this for the heavily stratified, so just importing it like this. So just as a preparation work, what I do in general, because I use texture blender, is to group them into another group, because I have that QP tool add-on that packs all of the textures, set up the right color space, so then you don't have anything else to do, and you have a very clean node tree and the ability to call on the group by just calling its name. So right now I'm just preparing them, removing the multiply because it's darkening the material. Even if they are just for preview, it's nicer for me. So the add-on renames the group by the name of the material, but they are all named by the ID. So I'm renaming them to something a bit more meaningful than the ID of the material. Like this I can look for them more easily. And by default I deactivate the ambient occlusion just in case you don't have any, but you can reactivate it and see, because some Megascan texture work way better with the ambient occlusion on. I could have done it as I was going along, but you can do that at any point. And now in my terrain, if I start looking for the name of the node group, you can just call it like this and you have your whole set of PBR texture already. I will use the texture blend node group, and then with the add-on QP tools you can link everything together just at once. So in DrawTerrain, when you create a plane, by default it has UVs, so you can use these UVs to map your textures on it, because Blender will not really understand the generated or object mapping mode. So feel free to use the UV mapping. I'm just bringing a tiny dude here to check the scale of the grass, but actually it doesn't really make sense because I have such a large terrain and I'm seeing it from far. You don't need to stick to the actual size. What matters is the feeling that you're gonna give to your landscape with the size of your texture. So I'm gonna end up changing it anyways. So you can just import all of the node groups that you want in your terrain shader and even swap them as you want. For example, I wanted to have the Rider Tundra moss for the black part on the bottom. You don't need to relink anything, you just need to change the name in the group. I'm not explaining too much how Texture Blender works. I have another tutorial that you can check on how to use it. Here I'm bringing in the utility mask for DrawTerrain. It will help separate the slope areas, so the part where I want rocks and the part where I want grass. And now you can see what I was talking about. For the mapping, might be real scale compared to how the material was created, but it doesn't match what we want. In terms of look, the important is the result, not really the accuracy. You can see how easy it is to switch from one set of texture to another like this. What I usually do also, because it's hard to select elements when you have atmospheric cubes or mist boxes and stuff, I just activate the tiny arrow and make the whole collection non-selectable. Don't forget that you did that because you might freak out thinking, like, how can I select my objects again? But like this you can freely select the visible object in the viewport. Here I wanted to have a bit more rocks in the distance, so tweaking the values of the terrain to give more slope, basically. Then I realized that I wanted a better separation, so I created a second plane and then recreated something that looks more like rock and sediment, like for the one in the foreground. Now I will add the grass, and I wanted to create a second layer for it. So I'm just gonna replace the node group name, link it with the QP tools, link node group feature. This feature comes with Texture Blender, not DrawTerrain. This is more working with hand in hand the two different tools, but I wanted to show you how I actually work from scratch to finish without skipping parts. So you can actually know and hopefully learn something from my workflow. So now I'm thinking I want to have the lowest part being the black sand and rocks, and then have the grass more higher in the elevation of the terrain. So I'm trying with the height map to see how it looks like. But in this case, I will use another node that I made for Texture Blender, which is to help mapping with an object. I noticed that there is a bug. That node, when you import it, is supposed to bring in an object that is in the green node as an object mapping. And when you import it by searching for it in the node editor, the import didn't work properly, even though the object seems to be in the Blender file. Normally they are imported at the center of the world, but here we cannot see it. So what I did, I pulled the asset browser, and in Texture Blender I will bring the object mapping. And by doing this time it imported the same object with 001, meaning that the first one was there somewhere. And when you do this, the object doesn't appear in the outliner. You need to refresh it and make a custom search that you can cancel straight away, and then it appears there, as you can see. So I can preview this node, remove the exclude flat faces, which is useful in certain cases, but in that case we really just want to have that sort of elevation. And scaling the object, rotating it, you can do customize the blending and the transitions. I really wanted to separate the bottommost part of the terrain and have more grass as we go up. So I preview it, but I realized the order of my layers were not right, because now the grass is taking over all of the layers, and including the rocks. So what I will do, I will create a sub-layer before the first blending. So I will blend the grass and the black ground together before they are blended into below the rocks. I don't want to advertise too much Texture Blender, but you can see how easily it is to connect, disconnect and reconnect all of these nodes together without losing time or losing your mind doing it over and over again. Just need to keep things slightly clean. And here you go. Now I have my 3 layers the way they are supposed to be. And by scaling this node, you can make your transition more harsh or more soft. You can scale it in Z. So here I'm showing a bit what I was looking at and what I was referencing in my mind. So what being advantage of working with node groups like this is that if you have that grass replicated in different materials and you want to change its color, for example, or the value or anything, normally you would have to add a node group that would either do it everywhere, or you would have to replicate the, for example, hue saturation value node every time you use that set of textures. But being in a node group, it's like a set that is being reused and customized every time. So you can take advantage of this. Either you can tweak it on a global scale inside the node group, all of these values and colors, or if you want to have a particular variation in a special material, you can do it outside of the node group, and then it won't be replicated everywhere. Here I wanted to give a bit more variation into the grass color, so I'm adding a noise, and you can see when generated or object mode is selected, it doesn't work as well, so you can just use the UVs. And that gives a slightly better variation of colors that I will refine over and over. I think the grass will be my dark point into this illustration that I will fix after. I also wanted to try something by having a color RAM that has a not so big difference in values between them and putting it into the hue to have a variable variation of hues. It's gonna give a bit of a rainbow effect, you will see. But by controlling this, you could have interesting effects depending on how controlled it is. Just a bit too much, so I ended up removing it, just to show how creative you could be with playing with nodes. So you know when everyone says you need to go through an ugly phase before being able to have something pretty? I think we are right there. So the difference in value seemed too strong for me between the grass and the rest of the materials, so I was tweaking this a bit. And then the transition was a bit too harsh, so I'm changing a bit the object mapping and making it softer, and changing maybe its height. So it has some grass patches here and there. Seeing it now, I think that grass material or set of textures were probably not the most adequate, but that ended up not too bad. I just needed to do way more work to try to make it look interesting than having a better choice of texture beforehand. Here I'm tweaking the blending between the grass and the rocks because it seemed a bit too strong and obvious. And then I will also activate a feature from Texture Blender, which is displacement blending. So here I'm being bothered a bit by these objects on the right, but they give me an idea that it would be cool to have objects and rocks being stacked on that part of the illustration. So I'm going to give a bit of more details to the water by giving a bit of a normal map from a simple noise. So now I'm going to deal with these foreground rocky features. Just embracing the chaos. You could easily scatter objects instead of doing this. I just want to show only the use of draw scatter as much as possible and see different creative ways you could use it to achieve different sort of results. The advantage by doing this is that you have objects that have the same material, so they will blend nicely into your terrain. And now I'm changing actually the material. I will use the node groups that I created before, so I know that they will use the same shape language, but I actually want them to be rocks and not grass. So what I did, I'm just taking the whole layer, the blending between the grass and the black sand-ish thing, and I will just change the way they are blended together. So instead of using an object mapping, I will use an edgeware node that I have that can detect the connection between the proximity between objects, and it helps so much to blend between different materials more naturally. So the last feature is the object proximity. I'm just removing the two other ones. And now you can see how they blend more nicely. Now I'm gonna refine a bit the lighting and try to balance a bit more the intensities of the lights and the softness of the shadows. What I realized is that by changing the spread of the light, the more narrow you make it, the more strong, harsh shadows it makes. I thought that it would respect the size of the light, but by reducing the spread, it also makes it sharper. Here I'm importing just a gobo plane. It's just a noise texture applied on the plane. The goal is to break up the lights. Sometimes adding texture to your lights can solve the problem of details in your shading, for example. Here I was trying to see how I could bring back some shapes from these rocks and bring a bit more light in the foreground. I ended up deleting it because I didn't like it. Playing a bit with the post effects that photographer has, adding a bit of lens distortion, chromatic aberration, fringing bloom depending on your scene. In this case there is not too much contrast or very hot spots, so it doesn't affect that much. But a bit of bloom, vignetting and film grain. It's probably better to put the film grain into Photoshop or Krita or Clip Studio Paint depending on what you use. But in this case I just wanted to push as much as I could in Blender. And I really like the CinemaScope aspect ratio, so I was changing a bit the aspect ratio, moving a bit the camera to see if I can find even better angle. And I think at this point I was thinking that I had a good start, not too bad results, but there were still a few areas that were bothering me. A bit the mountains in the back, the one on the right that was way too plain, and the grass that's also too simple. It doesn't look alive much. And here I wanted to show the documentation website I have on Notion, so you can take a look. I tried to make it very interesting as much as I could with a bit of text, but every time a video to show me playing around with the tool and show how it behaves. So you can understand step by step how to use the tools DrawTerrain, but also DrawScatter and Texture Blender, on top of having the tutorial. And one special feature that I absolutely love and I'm very excited about is the ability to bake and export your height map and send it to Gaia. And so like this in Blender, you can work your composition exactly the way you want, export your terrain to Gaia, and have it run their awesome algorithm for erosion. It could be a world creator, or you can even send it to Unreal Engine if you want to. So like this you can import your height map, and even if you change the curves and the shape of your mountain, you can always rebake the height map and update it inside Gaia and re-export it. I think it's very cool for matte painters, for example, who want to push beyond these shapes and have something very realistic. I just blur a bit the terrain because it's harsh coming from Blender, because it's baking from the geometry, so you're limited to the geometry you have. But you can see how in a few seconds you have very pushed terrain. And then you could have them directly in your scene in a way if you re-import it back. It's a bit more organization, but you have that ability, which is really cool. I love Gaia. So here I was trying to think of what could be the next steps to finish it up. And actually after this recording I took a bit more time to refine the different features and different elements, particularly the mountain on the right, the grass, and I am going to show you how it looks like now and what I did. So here's the terrain in its final stage. It's changed a bit. I ended up changing the material for the rocks, for the darker one that I imported before, and changing a bit the color of the grass. You can see those darker patches. I will show you what I actually did. Oops, I just deactivated. I wanted to just make it unselectable. So I went there into the grass and I just added some noise. So one that is linked to the factor of an RGB curve to make darker patch, and one with the color here. So you can see if I plug this like that. And I changed a bit also the way the blending works with the rocks by adding this node that adds this into the grass. So basically putting more rocks into the grass areas and the ones you see here, because like this has a better breakdown and it feels more integrated in this case. What else did I do? I lowered the color of the water because it was too bright, like this, a bit distracting. So by lowering it, it's integrated a bit better. Here I ended up putting this in the darkness, but I have now two layers of it, like the rock layer and the grass layer, like the other ones. And what is making the scene pretty slow is the clouds. It's just volumetric with some noise in there. If I remove it, it looks like that. But I wanted to have a bit that cloudy sky, because I like it like that, but I like the dramatic effect this does. So I ended up painting between the two renders, with and without these clouds. So I hope this breakdown and that time lapse was useful and will make you want to try out DrawTerrain, and that you will have fun with it, because I really like it, I really love it. So yeah, peace.